Hey everybody, welcome to C3. I'm Kent Dobson. Thanks for joining us today. Happy Easter, happy spring, happy Pesach, Passover. I'm very excited today, really, because I'm continuing my series called Meaning Matters, and we're entering a new word. So each month we take a look at a new word, and the word for this month is paradox. Why am I excited to talk about paradox? Well, it's something that a lot of my talks kind of hover around, and sometimes it's a word people use in spiritual-ish conversations. It's a paradox. Well, what do we mean by that? And that's what we want to talk about this month. What is a paradox? Why is it important? What does it have to teach us? How do we carry or relate to the paradoxes of life? Because there are paradoxes. Even without a definition, you probably agree with what I'm saying. Yep, life, it feels like that life is a series of paradoxes. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about it this month. And I think actually it is the right word for Easter. It's the right word for this time of year. It's the right word for the Passover story. It's the right word for the image of the cross, which is a kind of paradoxical image. So that's kind of the train I want to explore today, and I'm happy you're here. And as always, we have Talkback, which follows this each week, a chance for us to talk about what we heard. So if that's something you're interested in, and you don't just want to listen to the talk, which you're welcome to do, but you want to participate in the conversation, 11 o'clock each week on Sundays, we have our Talkback, and you can sign up for that Zoom link through our website by joining our mailing list and getting our weekly newsletter. Highly recommend it. All kinds of good stuff in there about what C3 is up to in West Michigan, and along with resources like teachings and links to our guest musicians and so forth. So I really want to thank all of our musicians that we have each week. I want to thank our guests for making this happen. I want to thank all of you for contributing to C3. I think a place like C3 matters in the world, belongs in the world. I see us as a community that's on kind of the edge of spirituality, of what it means to be a spiritual community in the 21st century. We're on the edge of that, asking certain kinds of questions, and I hope that that's making a meaningful contribution, and I hope you hear a hint, a guess, and a clue in the teachings and talks that we offer each week. And in any way, shape, or form that you can get involved in what we're up to, we want to invite you to do so, whether it's online or when we begin meeting back in person. We're looking already at the first weekend in May as doing an in-person gathering. So anyway, I'd love to have you there. So let's talk about paradox. So it's a Greek word, and it means, well, it has a couple different meanings, as ancient languages, all languages, but particularly ancient ones, words can have double meanings. So para, the first part, can mean distinct or to make a distinction even. And dox can mean opinion. So to have a distinct opinion. That's often how people use it. Like an opinion over here and an opinion over there. That's maybe one way of putting it. But the word paradox is a little deeper, and I think some nuances maybe should be brought out. Para actually means technically to come alongside, and I like that better. To come alongside, and dox can mean difference. So a paradox is to come alongside a difference. And I love that, because what are we invited to do? To come alongside a difference, a contrary opinion, something and its opposite, just to come alongside it. Or what happens when we allow a difference to come alongside us? And wouldn't you say we need that? I mean, I know everybody talks about the polarized country and the right and the left and the blue states and the red states, even though all that's just a visual facade, really. Um, what's it like to come alongside an opinion or a difference? How do we bear that difference? I mean, that's what marriage is, or having a partner, to come alongside difference. It's a paradox. By the way, there's another nuance here with the word dox, which I said can mean opinion, but technically it means praise, which I love. Like, if you take the word orthodox, we take orthodox, like, oh, someone's orthodox, they have correct beliefs. But ortho means straight, like orthodontist, straight teeth, which I've never been to, obviously. Orthodontist, and ortho is straight, and dox is praise. So technically, being orthodox is having a kind of straight praise. See, that's already better than opinion or or a statement of belief. Just to get your praise aligned, you know. So to come alongside praise is a paradox. That's a strange. So it's a mysterious word. Already here, as we're just having an opening conversation about it. So I want to try to be clear at the beginning. How can two opposing things be true? Or a better way of saying it is what happens when we put things that seem to be opposed alongside one another? What happens in the dynamic relationship between things? Between differences? And how might both parties, in a sense, be changed through the tension of opposites, you could say? That's what a paradox is. A paradox is not something that can be solved. If it can be solved, it's not a paradox, it's just a conundrum. It's just a problem that you haven't looked at enough. And there are plenty of problems we haven't looked at enough. There's not a lot of complex thinking and careful thinking around certain issues and problems and themes, and sometimes that's what's needed. But that's not really a paradox. A paradox is something that you can't seem to resolve. Which is it? And part of you wants to say yes. There are even scientific paradoxes. It's like the wave and particle business from light. Well, is it a wave or is it a particle? And the answer is yes. And how can that be in our modern scientific Western-oriented mindset says, well, it's got to be one or the other. And the paradoxes come in and say, what happens if you just hold them in tension? Because I think holding things in tension like this, getting close to a paradox, allowing paradoxes to come alongside, shifts our consciousness in some way. It doesn't just give us information, but shifts our consciousness, like in the sense of shifts our awareness of who we are and what is true and just slightly. And we need a massive shift in consciousness. I've said many times, I'm almost tired of saying it, the quotation from Einstein, no problem can be solved by the same consciousness that created it. And I just want to add to that, yes, but how do you shift your consciousness? And that's a complex question. And that's a question that I think spirituality ought to be dealing with. Even religion ought to be dealing with. How does one shift their consciousness? Maybe a better question is, how does one allow one's consciousness to be shifted? Because oftentimes the ego, our ordinary mindset, that's all I mean by ego right now, is who we think we are and the way the world works. We don't want that to change. It's like, no, I don't want to change. And I certainly don't want you to change. I need you to either be someone I can be against or for. And don't confuse things, because I don't want to change all that much. And I think, anyway, my main point is, how is our consciousness shifted? And one of the suggestions I'm offering this morning is our consciousness shifts when we get close to paradox. Because how the world works gets shook up. We're like, I can't resolve this. And that is potent and fertile ground. It's almost like something of our worldview cracks a bit and crumbles a bit and fades a bit and dies a little bit, and something is yet to be born. It's kind of that sort of space, and that's potent. That's a potent space. And that's the time of year we're in. Springtime is that time of year. Something has ended, something isn't quite here. Winter is over and summer is yet to arrive, and it's that in-between land, and here it comes around each year, you know. I think pulling us alongside the paradoxes of life. So I'd like to say something else, because I hope in some ways today's talk is kind of an introduction to paradox, which we'll be dealing with all month, whether my teachings or guests that we're bringing in. So I think we live in an age of paradox, really. And I'm saying that because scientific enlightenment, the Enlightenment, I think served the world well. It's why we have something like a vaccine, because it was busy making distinctions. And remember, that's part of para, to make distinct. This and not that, this and not that. That's the foundation of science, and careful inquiring very carefully into things, and categorizing and labeling, and also at the tail end of the scientific era, we're bumping into things like quarks that don't make sense. That, wait a minute, the universe isn't playing by the rules that we've all agreed to, and it's pulling us alongside a paradox. So we're in the age of paradox, where we're bumping into this more and more. And the more we learn about the human brain, about brain chemistry, about brain wiring, I always use quotation marks. If you're listening on podcast, I just did air quotes, because there's something I don't like about calling the human brain, or referring to the human brain as computer. I think it's a little bit unfair, but we're learning a lot about, quote, the way the brain is wired, and chemistries and neurons and synapses and chemicals, and maybe I already said that, and how that relates to our emotions and our body and what we might call the psyche, and our wounds and our emotional wounds and our memories, and there are a lot of paradoxes in the realm of the brain and beliefs even. We keep bumping into mysteries. And I know science might say something like, we're going to figure it all out. And I want to say, well, keep going. Good luck with that. Definitely. If you're a scientist, pedal to the metal. Go all the way, man. And also, we will bump into things that we're going to have to hold alongside other things. We'll bump into contradictions. And so I think we live in an age of paradox, and sometimes that has the effect of pulling us toward nihilism. And if I can make any contribution in my teachings and talks and writings, it's to make little off-ramps out of the allure of nihilism. I think nihilism is a kind of cultural disease in a way, and possibility. And nihilism, what I mean by that is, like, things get so overwhelming that we just say, well, there is no meaning. There is no meaning, period. This is the far side, this is the dark side of the moon of postmodern consciousness. And I'm not anti-postmodern, I just mean the dark side of the moon is nothing is meaningless, or nothing is meaningful. And that saps the soul and the vitality of life. And I think clouds our ability to act in the world in ways that bring goodness and prosperity and justice, and the desire to right wrongs where we can. Not that we can right them all, but I think nihilism, it's something we all fall into, and I'd love to provide some off-ramps. And one of the off-ramps, I think, is to embrace paradox as a coincidence of opposites. I think that's Julian of Norwich, coincidence of opposites. I think that's what she says of the cross. But let's just say the opposites. Embracing the tensions of opposites and letting it work on us, and in a way celebrating it. celebrating human frailty as much as human ingenuity. It puts us in that realm where a fair amount of humility is in order. That's the age of paradox. And in other words, I'm saying, let's embrace it where we can and embrace it with a kind of humility, kind of earthy humility. From dust you came, to dust you shall return. So I want to mention some big paradoxes, and then I'm going to say a few things about Easter and Passover too. So one of the paradoxes that has been working me, and I'm not going to resolve it here, is the East-West tension. The wisdom of the East and the wisdom of the West. And I'm going to make some big generalizations here and see if you can't track with what I'm saying. Like, part of me is in love with the Tao, the yin and yang, the cycle of nature, the way things are. And the Tao that gives us the wisdom to just let things be, just let them be as they are. Everything is impermanent. Everything is turning over. There's always a spring, and there's always a fall. There's always the death of something, and there's always the rebirth of something. Around and around and around it goes. And this is the wisdom of the East, is the wisdom of the Tao. This is submitting to the way of nature. That's really what the Tao means. And in some ways, in my own spiritual path and practice, I'm looking for ways to align myself with the Tao, with nature, with reality, with the way things are. And I think that's part of the gift of the Tao. And I have the West and its wisdom. And the West has given us words like redemption. Do you see how that's already fundamentally different in the paradoxical sense from just letting it be? Well, no, some things can be redeemed. Or let it be, yet, but some things can be saved, or the very notion of salvation. Now, that might rub you the wrong way if you have some hang-ups around the way Christianity has occasionally used that word, but you know what I mean, the redemption of things, the salvation of things. And we say, well, which is it? Should we just let it be, or can things be redeemed? Or the endless impermanence of everything, or resurrection, which is the central image of today, Easter Sunday. Well, which is it? And part of me wants to say, yes, but I don't know how, and that's a paradox. Let's put them alongside. Let's put the East and the West alongside. How might both mirror back to something the other doesn't quite recognize in the turning over of things? What happens when we cast the East alongside the West? What happens when we cast the Tao alongside redemption? Like, here are some lines. Here's a great Taoist line. I've been using this occasionally with myself. The bad news is that you're falling. The good news is there's no bottom. See, that's very Tao-like. The bad news is that you're falling. The good news is there's no bottom. Well, here's a line that's more on the redemptive side of things. Like, there's that Leonard Cohen line, there's a crack in everything, and that's where the light gets in. There's a crack in everything. That's the wounded and broken and cracked and fragmented. And paradoxically, I might add, that's where the light gets in, through the wound. And the light is the light of redemption and restoration, we might say. And of course, Leonard Cohen is himself Jewish, coming from the Western redemptive tradition, even though he himself, I think, spent many years in a Buddhist monastery. So he's a one of paradox, East and West. Thomas Merton, I think, of someone deep, deep, deep in the best of the Western Christian mystical contemplative tradition, in love with the West and the Tao and the Buddhists and the tradition of the East. And he spent the latter 10 years of his life trying to work that out, and maybe just allowing the paradox of these tensions to be alongside one another. And I want to say something at this point. I'm not just arguing that Well, if it's true for you, it's true for you. If it's true for me, it's true for me. No one really knows anything. This kind of aloof postmodern attitude that I'm sometimes guilty of, I'm not talking about that. I'm saying, really, what if these things are alongside one another and they create tension between the two? Like the invisible tension of a tuning fork that's rung, between the two poles of the tuning fork and the vibrations that's happening in between. That's what I'm saying. That's what a paradox can be. Now that's big stuff, east-west. Let's take it more personal. Here are some paradoxes. I am whole, I am enough, and I belong. I am whole, I am enough, and I belong. Yes. And also, I'm not what I could be. I'm wounded and I don't fit in. I'm not what I could be in terms of potential. I have some wounds and I don't fit. Sometimes I don't even feel like I fit in the 21st century. Really? What world am I in? So which is it? Which is it? The tuning fork. I'd like to suggest the tuning fork. The resonance between these two, the vibration of energy that passes between the poles. Here's another one. If you have kids or grandkids or nieces or nephews, you look at them sometimes and you know that they are just fine the way they are, like deeply. They are just 100% fine being exactly who they are. And some days you look at them and you see they're not what they could be. And which is it? Which is it? Which is it? And I think we're getting close to a paradox. We're getting close to a paradox. I think this is a kind of paradoxical tension that we carry as human beings. This is the burden of being a human being, that we deeply belong here. I very much oppose the idea that human beings are some kind of like disease on the earth and they don't belong. And I do agree that human beings cause tremendous suffering to the planetary systems. I agree 100%. But we are nature. We evolved. We're intimately connected and interwoven to everything that is. So we belong here. And also, maybe it's because of human consciousness, we feel like we don't belong and we feel alien. And so it's part of I think the burden of being human. We deeply belong here and we feel like we don't fit and we want to mess with the world. And positively, we see how the world could be better, or our communities could be better, our families could be better. And negatively, we see how we could make them a whole hell of a lot worse. That's a burden. That's a burden. It's a paradoxical burden that I think we're invited to carry as human beings. And let me say a few things about Easter here, because, well, maybe I'll start with Passover. I like to mix Passover and Easter because they're mixed, because Jesus was killed on Passover. And, on the very festival that celebrates liberation, he's executed by an oppressive and evil regime, meaning Rome. Now that, talk about, that's more irony. Talk about an irony. Let's eat a meal with our families and sing songs of liberation. And meanwhile, the marginalized in our own community are hanging on Roman crosses. Jesus wasn't the only one. By no means. So Passover, a couple paradoxes of Passover. One of the things I love about Passover in the Jewish tradition is how it mixes time. One of the things you say in the Haggadah, which is the liturgy of Passover, is you say, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. Now imagine that. Just a kid from the 21st century who parents said, you can't bring your iPhone to Passover dinner. Okay, fine, I'll put it over here, saying we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. I mean, so already there's a kind of, this is my story and it's their story. Happened to them a long time ago. And we might say, well, which is it? You need to decide. And the tradition is saying, don't decide. This happened to our ancestors, and it's happening to us. I was a slave to something 5 minutes ago, or I'm a slave to something now. And here are the tensions. Here are the tensions. In bondage to something and freedom. Those are the major tensions in the Passover. And why celebrate it every year? Because every year we have to be reminded of this kind of thing. And the movement and the passage and the mystery that moves us from slavery to freedom. And sometimes from the outside perspective, we seem free, and internally we're in bondage. And there are those who externally are in slavery and inside have a kind of inner freedom. So it's this great tension, this great pull. It's a tuning fork again. And every year on Passover, it's thrown. And you could say between bondage and redemption. That brings a little bit more of a Christian language in there. Or the fact that it happens every year during the springtime. So from winter to spring. Or what's T.S. Eliot's line? April is the cruelest month, breeding dead lilacs of the dead land. April is the cruelest month, breeding dead lilacs of the dead land. Or breeding, what does he say? Breeding dead lilacs of the dead land. I think that's the line. It's a cruel month, and somewhere in the mixture of cruelty and harsh winds, and especially in Michigan, it's warm one day and it's brutal the next. It feels colder than the middle of winter, and it's only 30 degrees because we're in that in between time, and it's and yet lilacs are breeding. That's getting us close to, I think, a kind of paradox. I think T.S. Eliot is getting close to a kind of paradox. And let's, for a few moments, let's reflect on the image of the cross itself. And I'm not asking you today to be a believer or a certain kind of believer. I'm asking, how might this image shine in on us for a few minutes and open us up to the paradox? I can think of one. Even the cross itself has this vertical dimension that connects the upper world and the underworld, and here Jesus is hanging between worlds, between the heavens, the divine, mythically and archetypally, and the underworld, and Hades and death and the tomb where he will be in a matter of moments. He's suspended between worlds, between death and life. And we could also say of the story itself that it's a paradoxical story, that in suffering, there's some kind of redemption. That in the worst that can happen to human beings, the worst that other human beings can do to other human beings, which is falsely accuse them and murder them, in that somehow there's a redemptive turning. That it's liberating for him. That's the image of resurrection. It's liberating to his followers. It's like, okay, the worst that life can dish out somehow doesn't have the final word, the final say. Something still is put in the ground and comes back out again. The lilacs emerge in the cruelest month of April, eventually, we would say. See, and why celebrate Easter every year? It's not for those nasty Cadbury eggs. It's like the texture of them is just all wrong, It's not for that. It's to pull us alongside the paradoxes of life, of meaning, of death, of birth, of new life. Here's another paradoxical tension. Jesus prays in the garden, "Not my will, but yours." Very famous line. Not my will, but yours. See, there's a paradox there because he has a will. Jesus is saying, in a way, I'm paraphrasing, I don't want this to happen, but I don't know. Maybe there's another way. Now, that's a very humble place to be. That's a good stance to take in the midst of paradox. I don't know. I don't want it to be this way, but maybe there's a mystery at work that I don't know very much about. That's an open-hearted, open-minded way of standing between the poles, I suppose we could say. My favorite paradox in the Jesus story is the two thieves. One believes and one doesn't. So you've got this vertical dimension, but you have the horizontal dimension, and Jesus has they're zealots, if you want to be technical about it, revolutionaries on either side. One believes something about Jesus, the other doesn't seem to, and I say that's what my life is like, One part of me is in deep disbelief and doubt, and another part of me is all in. I don't know on what exactly, but it's like it's a yes and there's a no. And what happens in the resonance between the two? What if we allowed our doubts to exist and we allowed our beliefs to exist? Or we allowed our convictions, I like that better than beliefs maybe, things we somehow can say, this is true. We allow them to exist alongside the doubts. Oh, I doubt this is true. And maybe the big questions of Easter, maybe if you want to take it personally here, what is dying and what is being reborn? Or what is dying and what is being born? Maybe that's a better way of saying it. What is dying and what is being born? And I think that's what paradox does to us. In the tension, in the poles between something dies, something of our old worldview dies, and sometimes something new emerges, though we can't quite predict what. And I think that's part of the invitation to come alongside or allow the paradoxes to shine in on our life. And to bring consciousness and attention to these opposites. That's what I'm hearing. That's what I think about today on Easter. That's what I think about when I think about paradox. And what's the second half? I want to end with T.S. Eliot's line, "April is the cruelest month, breeding dead lilacs out of dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain." Mixing memory and desire, past and future, memory and desire. What we remember happened to us and happened to our ancestors, our complex histories, and our deep desires and longings, mixing them together. That's what's happening in that underworld, cruel time of April in the tomb, so to speak, when things are stirring. And he says, stirring dull roots with spring rain. And this is where I want to end. 2020 and now 2021 and the coronavirus and the political election and the global pandemic and the global economic weirdness and the influx of information about what's happening on our borders and on our streets and the darkness and the loss of life and gun violence is fatiguing. And maybe you feel dull. Your roots are dull. It feels like a cruel month. And here I am coughing, which I don't plan to edit out. A whimpering cough at the end of 2020 feels about right. And yet, the paradox is that the mystery I'm interpreting here also mixes in the soil spring rains. And that's what I wish for you today. That's what I wish for you on Easter. In your own paradoxes and tensions and poles and doubts and beliefs and something is dying and not yet to be born, I'm wishing, as I am for the earth and for all of us, that our dull roots would taste a bit of the mysteries of the spring rain, that rejuvenating pole. On the one hand, we're dry. On the other hand, there's a spring rain that's soaking into the earth. Peace. I'll see you soon.